Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Dr. Shafer of Talks with Dr. Shafer. Today, instead of our regular episodes, we are giving you a taste of a podcast we think you'll love as much as we do. The name is Say More with Tulaine Montgomery, and in it, Tulaine talks to people who are dedicated to making the world a better place, all while taking care of themselves and supporting one another. In this particular episode, she interviews Dr. Richard Davidson, the founder of the Center for Healthy Minds. He explains how we are hardwired to build connections and teaches us how to cultivate well-being through 4 easy steps. If you like what you hear, don't forget to follow the link in the show notes to subscribe to her podcast and listen to more episodes. Here's Tulaine's conversation with Dr. Richard Davidson. Enjoy.
It's a growing body of research that suggests that we actually are born to be pro-social. We are born to be kind. We are born to connect. Even those who may not be in touch with it, who may have, through unfortunate circumstances, been pulled away from who they really are. At our roots, this is really part of who we are as a species.
In a moment when our society feels more divided than ever, join us as we explore what it means to adapt and evolve together. Welcome to Say More. I'm Tulaine Montgomery, CEO of New Profit, and your host. Hello, Say More family. It's good to be back with you. Listen, we talk a lot on Say More about owning our multitudes, that we are all multi-dimensional humans, and that we are people of many interests and curiosities. And so that's true for me as well as anyone. And I'll tell you, high up on my list of interests are these brains of ours. I am a neuroscience geek. I read all the literature I can get my hands on, and I am just fascinated by what we've been learning in the past several years about these brains of ours. And thankfully, I know just enough to get myself in trouble, but thankfully I have the blessing of being in community with people who are not aspiring neuroscientists, but actual neuroscientists, skilled and studied. Dr. Richard Davidson, goes by Richie, is an established neuroscientist who, like me, like all of us in the Say More community, cares deeply about what we can do with what we know to make things better. He is a professor of psychology and psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the director of the Center for Healthy Minds. He's also the founder of Healthy Minds Innovation, a nonprofit that researches scientific tools for well-being. In our conversation, it was for me energizing and encouraging. I think you'll find it the same, because he confirms that there are simple steps we can take. He actually names 4 that can enable us to consistently look after ourselves and each other. He also explains how we're actually hardwired to build connections. That even though history has shown us humans hurting humans over and over again, that we are actually wired for something different if we find a way to cultivate that part of our minds. Richie shares his experiences with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We talk about spirituality and science coming together, and we have a lot of fun too. I found this conversation enlightening and honestly really encouraging. I hope the same is true for you. Hi there.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good.
Good to be reconnected. I'm going to remind you of something. Many moons ago, actually about a year ago, we at New Profit hosted something called The Well. And you, Richie, came and joined us and shared your insights around these brains of ours and how we can create spaces and conversations that make it easy for people to connect.
Okay.
And we actually even created these cards. And for listeners, I'm showing this beautiful deck of conversation cards, or connection cards, as we call them, that were done in partnership with Healthy Minds Innovations. So you spent time and you helped us come up with a whole deck of prompts and starters for enabling people to connect. And so I am a big fan of you and your work, and I'm really excited to be in conversation with you today.
Oh, sweet. Thank you so much for that warm introduction.
I want to kind of do a little bit of an icebreaker, a way to get us both here. I know we both are coming from different places. And I'm going to use one of the cards you helped us create to guide us. So one of the cards that I have here says, there's so many good options. Oh, here's a good one. And I want you to answer this question, Richie, and also tell us a bit about the science behind the question, because you helped us name this question as a way to enable connection. So the question is, when is the last time that you had your breath taken away by the beauty of something, a piece of art, a song, a good deed, etc.? When's the last time, Richie, that your breath was taken away by something?
Great question. And thank you for asking and the context in which it was asked and the way in which you asked it. So what immediately comes to mind is that exactly 2 weeks ago, I was in Dharamsala, India, with the Dalai Lama, who is now 88 years old. And just before I was with him individually, I witnessed what he does typically 3 or 4 times every week in the morning, beginning at 8 a.m. And that is, he blesses a very large receiving line, often people to travel a great distance to be blessed just for a few moments by him. And it was a receiving line of about 400 people. Some of them were in wheelchairs, on crutches. Some of them were from Tibet. Some of them were from Nepal. There was a group from somewhere in Eastern Europe, and it was old people, infants, and everyone in between.
Wow.
And this was a line that snaked around, and His Holiness was sitting, and each person came up to His Holiness, and His Holiness gave them a blessing, touched them, said a few words to them. And it took around an hour and a half, maybe a little bit longer, to receive all 400 of these people. And it was compassion in action. And I just was standing there as a witness with tears in my eyes, just taking this all in. And I've seen this many times before. This was not the first time I saw this, but every time it's a very deeply moving experience.
That's incredible. I would never have predicted that your response to this question would be time witnessing His Holiness the Dalai Lama blessing people across generations. Wow. So talk to us a bit about what happens to you, the storyteller, and to me and the audience, the listeners. What happens to us when we hear a story like that? Because again, the origin of that question is New Prophet working with you and your organization to create questions that enable connection. So talk to us about the neuroscience behind that question and what's happening to our brains as you're either sharing or listening to that story.
Yeah. So, I think these are moments when we connect both within ourselves as well as to others with our common humanity. And there is a lot of research, and it's a growing body of research that suggests that we actually are born to be pro-social. We are born to be kind. We are born to connect. This is part of who we are as a species. And when we have opportunities to remind us of these innate qualities, there is a palpable experience of connection, of safety, of positive emotion. And in our brains, we know that there are specific networks that are activated that are involved in caring and also in perspective taking, where we can take the perspective of another. And these are networks in our brain that really are at the root of this propensity for connection that all human beings share. Even those who may not be in touch with it, who may have, through unfortunate circumstances, been pulled away from who they really are. But at our roots, this is really who every human being is. And one of the blessings of being with someone like His Holiness the Dalai Lama is that he has this facility of really getting to this root that we all share and connecting with it, and in that way reminding us of who we are.
So, Richie, there's a lot in what you said that I want to dig into. We're going to go a lot of places in this conversation because I loved hearing what you said. I loved hearing that science and research support what simply feels true to my spirit and heart, which is that at our best, uninterrupted, we human beings are herd animals. We are oriented and hardwired to connect, and that we thrive with healthy connections, and that we desire healthy connections. Like, that sounds good to my ear. It feels good to my heart. My body relaxes as I hear you say it. And yet there is so much evidence in terms of our behavior. I'm a student of history, and history continues to show examples of, when given a choice, human beings collectively choosing fragmentation, conflict, violence, scarcity mindsets, competition for resources. And so how do you reconcile our sort of track record as a species with what the data is starting to reveal about our natural orientation for being pro-social?
Yeah. So, that's a super important question. And I would say that the kind of evidence for fragmentation and divisiveness that you refer to, of course, is real. We all experience it. And it is, I would say, a product of our social circumstances, our political and economic situation, but it's not who we are at our roots as human beings. I can tell you with a lot of authority that the vast, vast majority of human beings come into the world with a pro-social orientation. They don't come into the world with a mindset of scarcity and divisiveness and us and them. They come into the world with innately programmed pro-social cooperation as the kind of baseline characteristic. And there is really a robust body of hard-nosed scientific evidence to show that. Now, it's true that because of the unfortunate circumstances in many parts of the world today, we learn other ways of relating that are, I would say, inconsistent with our basic nature. They're maladaptive. They have led to the horrific mess that we find ourselves in. But that's not who we are. That's not our basic nature. As Nelson Mandela said, we can learn to hate, but we can also learn to love. And it's easier to learn to love because love is part of our innate predisposition, not hate.
So here's a fascinating, though not at all surprising statistic that proves Richie's point. 95% of infants demonstrate preference for a warm-hearted, gentle form of interaction, compared to a more aggressive form of interaction. Now, that's not surprising when you consider what you prefer in your own life day to day. And yet so many of our systems and norms reinforce aggressive, distant, even cold interactions as a way to advance, impact, change, or results. Interesting to notice the dissonance between what we actually know to be true, how we're made, and what we tend to do day to day.
Well, there's a body of research that, one way to look at this is to look at very young infants before they have the opportunity to be socialized out of this, so to speak. So how do 6-month-old infants behave? And there's a variety of research many of these studies have been published in the very best scientific journals in the world. This is not crackpot science. This is really mainstream, hard-nosed science. Young children do not make any judgments about the color of another person's skin until about age 3.
Okay.
So they're completely colorblind in this sense until about the age of 3, which is when biases begin to show up in human behavior. But prior to that, there's no such thing as bias based on race and the color of a person's skin. It doesn't exist. And so, yes, it is learned, but it's, that's not our innate predisposition.
So that is so, significant and profound. And I have thought a lot about how when we are infants and little ones and solely dependent on how adults around us treat us, for our safety and survival, that's an orientation. But like what you're saying, Richie, makes me think that, well, we're actually dependent on the adults around us, even into adulthood in ways we may deny as we get older. So let me ask you this. Talk to us a little bit more about the Center of Healthy Minds Innovation. I've called it lab, but center. Like, just talk more about the work you're doing, the enterprise you're leading, because I want the listeners to understand how you're connecting the dots between the science and the practice at the community level.
Yeah, so I appreciate you asking about that. There are 2 entities that I founded that are separate but closely interconnected. One is the Center for Healthy Minds, which is based at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's an interdisciplinary research center, and our mission is to cultivate well-being and relieve suffering through a scientific understanding of the mind. And it's a vibrant research center. We have faculty from many different parts of the university associated with our center. We have about 75 people working at the center. And what our primary mission there is research. In 2014, I founded another entity called Healthy Minds Innovations. Healthy Minds Innovations is a nonprofit corporation, and its mission is to take the insights from the science and turn them into tools that can be used to disseminate and measure well-being, particularly at scale. And one of the things that Healthy Minds Innovation does is to disseminate programs or curricula, if you will, to cultivate well-being. And one of the primary products that we have created is the Healthy Minds program, which is a mobile app that is totally freely available. There's absolutely no paywall. And the New York Times Wirecutter named it as one of the 3 best meditation apps for 2023.
Okay.
And it's totally free. You can get it wherever you get apps. And I would recommend to listeners, if they're interested in exploring this further, please download it. As I said, it is completely free, which gives me sort of ethical license to advertise it widely.
Exactly. Quick note, y'all. If you're interested in the Healthy Minds program meditation app, check out the link in the episode show notes. I want to go back to close the loop on an earlier open question. The brain, the mind, you define them as distinct. I'm not sure everyone does. We tend to use those 2 words interchangeably. What's the distinction? What's the overlap? What's the distinction between the brain and the mind?
Yeah, so that's a really challenging question. And I won't pretend to give a comprehensive answer because it would require lots of time and discussion. Let me say that for most scientists today, your intuition is right. That is, most scientists would really not make a distinction between the mind and the brain. They would basically say they're like 2 sides of the same coin. I feel that we need to have some dose of humility about this. And our mind is what we experience, at least in part. So we all have a first person familiarity with our own mind. We don't have a first-person familiarity with our brain.
Right.
There is questions about, how closely connected the mind and the brain are. And of course, in traditional mainstream neuroscience, 99% of neuroscientists would say that if there's no brain, there's no mind.
Mm-hmm.
And some spiritual traditions, however, have questioned that and have certain phenomena that they talk about in their traditions that lead to at least raising the possibility that it may not be quite the way we think it is. And my response to that is really to exercise humility to the best that I can and acknowledge that we just don't know. And so let me give you one specific example. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there is a phenomenon that is known as tukdam in Tibetan. And tukdam refers to a particular phenomenon that occurs just after the standard Western definition of death.
Okay.
In a select group of people. It doesn't occur in everyone. It occurs relatively rarely, but it occurs among advanced practitioners of meditation and in people who have lived particularly spiritual lives. And the characteristics of tukdam are such that even though a person has stopped breathing and they have no more heartbeat, the body is said to be intact. There's no decomposition. And there is a claim in the Tibetan texts that there is a residual quality of awareness that is still present, even though to a Western physician or scientist, we would consider the person dead.
Right.
So this is an interesting phenomenon. And a number of years ago, the Dalai Lama personally asked me to please investigate using tools of modern science.
Wow.
And so we actually have a project going on now based in India where we are looking at this.
Wow.
And it's been quite a journey. And one of the things that we've seen, which is pretty much the only thing that we can report today, and it's not that I'm being coy, but this is just where the research is, that indeed there appears to be a dramatically slowed rate of bodily decomposition, far slower than one would expect based on the environmental conditions among people who are said to be in tukdam.
Wow. There's so much in that. And I will say, there's a short list of people in my life who, if they ask me to do something, no is not an option. And I've never met His Holiness the Dalai Lama, but I would imagine that he would absolutely be on that list. I can't imagine a direct request being made for something that important and significant. And you keep using the word humility, Richie, which I think is a beautiful word. What I am observing is curiosity as well. And that does seem to be an important part of understanding these brains and minds of ours, is constant curiosity.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I love what you said about, the small group of people that you don't say no to. And yeah, I, would say I have a very small group too, maybe an N of one. But Dalai Lama is definitely that person for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's really interesting to note that on His Holiness's part, that curiosity exists, right? Like there's curiosity from all directions that I hear playing out right now around us having a collective desire as a species to understand our brains and the ways that that understanding can enable a higher quality of life. You see a call for that everywhere. Let me ask you this. So Healthy Minds Innovation is all about translating science into tools, as I understood your description. And so I'd love for you to share a couple of the gems in terms of tools. Like in particular, I was researching Richie and saw some language about the 4 constituents of well-being. And I wonder if you would just, for our audience, talk about those 4 constituents.
The 4 constituents that you're referring to, Tulaine, are what we have proposed to be 4 essential elements for human flourishing. And each of these elements exhibits what we call plasticity. That is, they can be trained. And this has led us to this really simple, but I think quite radical conclusion. And that is that well-being or flourishing is best regarded as a skill that can be nurtured.
Mm-hmm.
So what are these 4 pillars? The first pillar we call awareness. And awareness is where mindfulness would be. It also includes our capacity for self-awareness. And it includes a capacity that neuroscientists call meta-awareness. And meta-awareness is the capacity to know what our minds are doing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, to some listeners, that may sound strange. Don't we always know what our minds are doing? But I'll ask this of the listeners. How many of you have ever had the experience of reading a book where you're reading each word on a page and you may be reading one page and a second page, and after a few minutes, you have no friggin' idea what you've just read?
Yeah.
And that's an example of our minds being lost, of our not knowing what our minds are doing. But the moment we recognize it, it's a moment of awakening.
Yes.
And that's meta-awareness. And it turns out that that actually can be trained. So that's one important pillar, the first pillar. The second pillar we call connection. And connection is about qualities that are important for healthy social relationships, qualities like appreciation, gratitude, kindness, compassion. All of those qualities we know are so fundamental for humans to flourish. In fact, earlier this year, a few months ago, the Surgeon General of the United States issued a health advisory.
Yeah, we've talked
And the
about
advisory was around loneliness and social isolation.
Yeah.
And one of the things that Vivek Murthy pointed out in this report is that loneliness is a greater risk factor for early mortality than smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Wow. Now, I didn't quite say that again. Richard, say that one more time, because I don't think I actually took that specific data point away, even in my reading of the advisory. Say that one more time.
Yeah, loneliness is a greater risk factor for premature mortality than is smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Wow.
That's what the data show. And there's a graph in that report which actually shows this data. Loneliness is more than twice the risk factor of obesity in causing premature mortality.
Wow.
So this is really important and underscores why the Surgeon General chose to consider this an urgent public health issue.
Mm-hmm.
And the connection pillar is really about nurturing the qualities that promote increased social connection.
Mm-hmm.
So the third pillar we call insight. And insight is and this actually goes back to something you brought up, Tulaine, curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
It's about a curiosity-driven self-knowledge, and particularly knowledge of how we construct the narrative that we all have about ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
We all carry around in our mind a narrative about who we are. And what the narrative is a set of beliefs and expectations about ourselves. And it turns out that these beliefs and expectations actually filter our perception of the world.
Yeah.
And so what's really important for well-being is not so much to change this narrative, but it's to change our relationship to this narrative so that we can see the narrative for what it is, which is a bunch of beliefs and expectations. And we can, if you will, try on how it might be if we perceived a certain challenging situation with a different set of beliefs and expectations. How might that show up in our experience? So that's really what this pillar of insight is.
Let me ask you this. The insight, it's fascinating because the stories we tell ourselves, it's a big theme. And there's a lot of conversation these days in popular culture about reinventing oneself, right? And we tend to admire figures, celebrities in particular, people in general who reinvent themselves, who have a story about themselves, an identity, a brand, if you will, that they transform. And if they do it more than once, we're in awe. And is that kind of what you're talking about when you talk about insight? Is it sort of reinvention, or is it something more subtle than that?
I wouldn't say it's reinvention. It's not quite, I mean, it may ultimately result in reinvention, but the initial part, which is really the most important part, is simply the direct experiential realization that our beliefs and our expectations are shaping our experience of the world, and to have some distance from them, if you will, to not be completely hijacked by them. Most people don't even recognize that their experience of the world is mediated through these beliefs and expectations. They're so immersed, they're so absorbed in all the stuff that's happening around them that this is not something that is in their awareness. And so simply recognizing that it is the case that our beliefs and our expectations shape our experience of the world, and that we're literally constructing our worlds in this way. And if we constructed the world differently, we would experience the world differently. And so what's really important is simply to understand and appreciate and have some distance from these beliefs and expectations. And so, you know, we know that there are some people that have a very negative narrative. They have negative beliefs about themselves. They have low expectations of themselves. And this is a prescription for depression. And what's really important initially for those people is not to reinvent themselves, not to change the narrative, because that would be fighting with their own mind and often does not result in success. What's really important is for them to simply appreciate that it is a narrative, that their thoughts, their negative thoughts about themselves are simply thoughts. They're no different from any other thought. And they don't have to attach such special significance to it. That's what's really crucial.
So this was the third pillar, constituent, insight.
Yeah.
And so now there's a fourth. Yes.
The fourth is purpose. Purpose is about finding our true north in life, clarifying our values. And here it's not so much about finding something more purposeful to do in your life. And this is, you know, in certain ways similar to, it's not about reinventing yourself. So it's not about finding something more purposeful to do, but how can we find meaning and purpose in even the pedestrian activities of daily life? Can taking out the garbage be deeply meaningful? And the answer is, of course it could be. Every act in which we engage, even the most pedestrian, can be reframed as being deeply connected to our core values and our sense of purpose.
I love the way that you're talking about these things, insight, purpose, because, you know, I even did it myself in this conversation. You know, insight, that's about reinvention, right? It's about this big set of external facing activities and changes. And what you're naming with the four constituents of well-being, you're saying that we actually, in most cases, have access to what we need to play a bit, to consider, right? To consider a different way, to try on different relationships to different ideas and stories. And I'm using the word play because I do find in listening to you, Richie, that this can be done with a lightness as opposed to a heaviness. It doesn't have to be the somber endeavor.
Totally. And I love your injection of play. It's totally appropriate and absolutely.
Okay, Say More family. It's time for you to ask Richie your questions. If you'd like to contribute to future episodes, follow me on Instagram, LinkedIn, or X, which I stubbornly continue to call Twitter. I know, I am trying. There, you'll get a chance to be in conversation with upcoming guests. Okay, the first one comes from Grace Buckley 96 on Instagram. She says that she's in her 50s and works with K through 12 students in many ways in the work that she does. And she's concerned about how it seems, she's not sure it is, but it seems like anxiety, fear, and depression are more rampant among the tweens that she works with through college students. Is there any evidence of this? And if so, what's driving this trend? But first, she's acknowledging it seems that way. Is it actually that way based on the data? And if it is that way, what's enabling those outcomes?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. It is that way. The data are absolutely consistent with your intuition. But let me also say, this is not what you asked, but I'll just say it because it's relevant. The data also show that teachers in the K through 12 space themselves have very high levels of depression and anxiety. In fact, in recent work that we've done in 2 different parts of the United States in very diverse urban school systems, more than 50% of K through 12 teachers have significant levels of anxiety and depression, clinically significant levels, more than 50%. So these are the folks who are teaching our children, and that's of real concern. So this is a huge problem. And so, one question that I hear you asking is, where is this coming from? In part, it's coming from modeling the teachers. And so we're doing a lot of work now on teacher educator well-being, because if we can improve the well-being of educators, it's going to have trickle-down effects on the students.
Yeah.
If a teacher shows up and is really fully present and connected and has a deep connection to their sense of purpose and being a teacher, their students are going to learn better.
Yeah.
And their students are also going to osmotically absorb these qualities of flourishing from the teacher. There are many other roots to this. I mean, we're living in very challenging times for so many complex reasons. The kids today are unlikely going to achieve the same wealth as their parents. And I think this is kind of an existential challenge to our youth. The existential threat of climate change is real, and it produces a kind of eco-anxiety and a sense of hopelessness. This is real. And so kids today are facing challenges that I certainly didn't face when I was growing up.
Yeah.
And it's objectively a very difficult time. And so I feel like we have a moral obligation to equip our younger generation with the best skills that we can equip them with to help them navigate the challenges that they're currently facing.
Thank you so much for that response. And thank you, Grace Buckley, 96, for the question. I've one just follow on to that, and then another question from the same more community. My follow on is, I have an instinct that when people are stressed, anxious, furious without an outlet for rage, exhausted, and depressed, that it's really hard for them to do systems change work. It's hard to think about a transformed school system or improved use of resources that protects our planet if, we're in deficit. That's my hunch. And so a lot of the work that I do in my organization and also just in the sector is about trying to create ways that we can be calm, connected, and perhaps even joyful so that we can do the hard, complex work of systems change. And I just want to pressure test that instinct with you. Is there any sign?
I love it. I totally love it. And, sometimes people ask me about whether, how can we be working with individuals to improve individual well-being when the system is broken and we need systems change. And, I always say we need both.
Yeah.
It's not one or the other. And if people are burned out and they don't have vitality, they're not going to be effective agents for systems change.
Right.
So it's really crucial that we keep both in our focus.
Excellent. Well, I've been affirmed by a neuroscientist, and so I'm on the right path. So Grace Buckley has one more question, which I also am very curious about. There's a lot of talk about an anecdotal discussion about just the impact, primarily negative impact, that the sort of eyes on screen culture is having on all of us, certainly on young people, but on all of us, reduced attention spans, heightened anxiety, et cetera. And I just wanted to raise that because, the theory is that all the devices are making us less intelligent and more irritable and more lonely. That's the sort of simple way of saying it. It sometimes feels that way to me. And what is it that you're seeing in terms of the research? How are our brains impacted by our device-led culture that we're in today?
Yeah, so this is a really another really important and complicated question. And I would say that, and there's a lot of good research in this area on different aspects of this. There are a few things that are really important to say. One is that I don't think it's the devices per se that are the cause of suffering. It is the specific content and the way in which the device is programmed, so to speak, that I think is problematic. And I should say that just a few weeks after the Surgeon General issued his report on loneliness, there was another report in 2023 that was issued on youth mental health and social media. And the data there are really compelling and scary. And they basically show that there is a linear relationship between the amount of time that youth spend on social media per se and negative mental health outcomes.
Okay.
And for kids that are spending 6 hours or more on social media per day, there is greater than 20% prevalence of serious psychiatric disorder in that specific subgroup. And in the United States today, the average teenager spends, according to a recent very large sample, they spend approximately 3.5 hours per day on social media. So that's one set of issues. But I also think I'm a believer that technology can actually be harnessed for the good. And there is evidence for that as well. There's evidence that there are certain kinds of video games, for example, that can actually be beneficial. So it's not all bad.
Okay.
And I think that one of the important things that we need to do as a society that we really haven't done is educate kids in digital hygiene. So recent evidence indicates that the average American opens their phone 152 times a day. And I think most of us would agree that that's just not necessary. You don't have to open your phone 152 times a day.
That's right. That's right.
And we can learn to be better stewards of the technology that we have. And I think that this needs to actually be taught in school. I think it's a learnable skill. And the devices are not going to go away. That's not going to be a particularly effective strategy. So the challenge becomes, how can we harness these devices to actually promote the good and to help us flourish?
Thank you so much, Richie. It has been a pleasure. Is there anything you wanted to touch on, Richie, that we did not speak on? Anything else you want the listeners to hear?
I think it was great. And I love your questions and how you ask them. I just want to end by expressing my deepest appreciation to you, Tulaine, for all you're doing to help make this world a better place. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Richie. You're amazing. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe to Say More with Tulaine Montgomery so you don't miss out on new episodes. Please also rate and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Say More with Tulaine Montgomery is produced by New Prophet and Human Group Media. If you want to learn more about our work at New Prophet, visit newprophet.org. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'll catch you all in the next episode.